A wealthy man storms into a luxurious restaurant, his arrogance filling the room. When the waiter accidentally spills water, the man erupts in fury, insulting him in front of everyone. But just as he demands to see the owner, the room falls silent. The truth about who owns the restaurant leaves him frozen in his tracks. What happens next will leave you stunned. Watch till the end to witness a powerful twist that will change how you see respect and humility. And if you love stories that inspire and surprise, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The evening was buzzing inside La Prestige, one of the city's most exclusive fine dining restaurants. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over pristine, white tablecloths, and the gentle hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of glasses. Waiters in tailored uniforms moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates of exquisite dishes that looked more like works of art. At a corner table sat Mr. Langston, a man known not just for his wealth, but also for his arrogance. Dressed in an expensive tailored suit, he exuded an air of entitlement that seemed to make the other diners shrink in his presence. He tapped impatiently on the table, glancing at his gold watch as if every second wasted was an affront to his status. "Excuse me," Langston called out sharply, his voice cutting through the soft ambiance like a blade. A young waiter, barely in his 20s, hurried over with a nervous smile. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" the waiter asked politely, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his notepad. Langston didn't bother to hide his irritation. "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes and no one's brought me my wine. This is supposed to be a top-tier establishment. Are all of you incompetent, or is it just you?" The waiter's face reddened, but he nodded quickly. "My apologies, sir. I'll bring it right away." As the waiter turned to leave, his hand accidentally brushed against a water glass on the edge of the table, sending it tumbling over. The glass shattered on the floor, the sound drawing the attention of nearby diners. Langston shot up from his chair, his face a mask of fury. "You clumsy fool," he barked, his voice echoing across the room. "Do you even know how much this suit costs? Clearly they'll hire anyone these days." The waiter bent down quickly, fumbling to pick up the shards of glass, his hands shaking as Langston continued his tirade. "This is unacceptable," Langston snarled. "Where's the manager? I want to speak to whoever's in charge. This kind of service is a disgrace." The room had fallen silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. The waiter mumbled an apology, but Langston wasn't done. "I'm not interested in your apologies," he snapped. "Get me the owner. I want to know who's running this circus." The waiter stood slowly, his eyes wide with panic, and nodded. I'll get them for you," he said quietly before disappearing into the back. Langston straightened his jacket and smirked, looking around the room as if daring someone to challenge him. The other diners quickly looked away, unwilling to risk being the target of his ire. He folded his arms, his smug expression returning. "Let's see who's in charge of this mess," he muttered under his breath. But what Langston didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that the owner of La Prestige wasn't just another wealthy business person. And when they finally walked out to meet him, the truth would leave Langston and everyone else in the restaurant completely speechless. Langston sat back down, his smug grin unwavering, as he adjusted his cufflinks and glanced around the restaurant. The tension in the room was palpable. The other diners tried to carry on their conversations, but their hushed tones and stolen glances toward Langston betrayed their unease. Minutes later, the young waiter returned, his face pale but his posture slightly more composed. "Sir," he said softly, "the owner will be out shortly." Langston huffed, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. "Good. Maybe they can explain why this place is run like a circus." The waiter nodded and stepped aside, disappearing back into the kitchen. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation as everyone in the restaurant waited to see who would emerge. Langston leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. In his mind, he had already won. Then the double doors at the back of the restaurant swung open, and a figure stepped into view. The room seemed to hold its breath as the person walked with an air of quiet authority, their tailored suit sharp and understated. They weren't hurried, nor did they seem frazzled by the chaos that had unfolded. Instead, they moved with a confidence that commanded attention. Langston's smirk faltered slightly as the figure approached his table. There was something familiar about the way they carried themselves, something that made his stomach twist in a way he couldn't quite place. But it wasn't until the owner stood directly in front of him that the realization struck. "Mr. Langston," the owner said, their tone calm but unmistakably firm. "It's been a while." Langston froze, his eyes widening as he took in the face of the person standing before him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It was as if the world had suddenly tilted, and he was struggling to find his footing. The man standing before him wasn't just the owner of Le Prestige. It was David Sinclair, a former colleague Langston had worked with years ago. Back then, David had been quiet, unassuming, and, in Langston's eyes, destined for mediocrity. Langston had always dismissed him, barely acknowledging his existence in the corporate world they'd once shared. And now here he was, owning one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, his calm authority making Langston feel smaller by the second. "You," Langston finally stammered, his voice shaky. "You're the owner." David's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Yes," he said simply. "Welcome to La Prestige. I see you've already made quite an impression." The weight of David's words hung heavy in the air. Langston opened his mouth to speak but quickly shut it again, the power dynamic between them shifting in an instant. The confidence that had oozed from Langston moments earlier had evaporated, leaving him visibly unsettled. David gestured toward the seat across from Langston. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a question. Langston nodded quickly, his bravado entirely gone. Of course," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. David sat down, clasping his hands together as he regarded Langston with a calm intensity. "Tell me," he began, his voice steady, "what exactly seems to be the problem?" Langston squirmed under David's gaze, his confidence crumbling further with each passing second. He struggled to come up with an answer, but all he could manage was a weak, "It was a misunderstanding." David raised an eyebrow, his smile never wavering. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "From what I understand, you insulted one of my staff members. Would you care to elaborate?" The room was utterly silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on the table. Langston's face burned with humiliation as he tried to find a way out of the mess he'd created. But David wasn't finished. The next words he spoke would shake Langston, and everyone in the restaurant, to their core. Langston fidgeted in his seat, avoiding David's piercing gaze. The calm authority in David's demeanor felt heavier than any shouted reprimand ever could. The entire restaurant was silent, the diners pretending to eat while sneaking glances toward the table. Langston's arrogance had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. David leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know the waiter you insulted?" he asked, his tone measured. "The one you called a clumsy fool?" Langston hesitated, unsure of what to say. I don't know him," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "His name is Samuel," he said. "He's been with this restaurant for 2 years. He works double shifts to support his younger siblings after their parents passed away. He's one of the hardest working people I've ever met." Langston's face flushed with shame as David continued. "You see, Mr. Langston, people like Samuel don't just work here because they need to. They work here because they believe in what we've built, a place where everyone, from the staff to the guests, is treated with dignity and respect." David's gaze sharpened, his voice dropping slightly. "But people like you? You walk in here, dripping with entitlement, thinking your money gives you the right to look down on others. You think a suit and a bank account make you better than the people serving you?" Langston opened his mouth to protest, but David held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me finish," he said firmly. "Do you know why I started this restaurant? It wasn't just to serve good food or cater to wealthy clients. It was to create a space where everyone, no matter their background, feels valued." David leaned back in his chair, his expression softening just slightly. "I've been where Samuel is now," he said. "I've worked jobs where people like you barely saw me as a person. I know what it's like to be treated as if you don't matter, and that's why I won't tolerate anyone, no matter how much money they have, disrespecting my staff." Langston swallowed hard, his bravado completely shattered. I didn't mean," he began, but David cut him off with a pointed look. "Intentions don't matter," David said sharply. "Actions do. And your actions tonight showed me exactly who you are. The weight of David's words hung heavy in the air. Langston felt the judgment of the entire room pressing down on him, the shame almost unbearable. He looked down at the table, unable to meet David's gaze. David stood, straightening his jacket. "You're free to stay and finish your meal," he said, his voice calm but final. "But if you can't treat my staff with the respect they deserve, I suggest you find somewhere else to dine." Langston's face turned crimson, and for a moment it seemed like he might argue. But instead he nodded silently, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The once proud businessman now looked like a shadow of himself. David turned to the rest of the room, addressing the diners who had been watching the scene unfold. "Thank you for your patience," he said, his voice warm but commanding. "I apologize for the disruption. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." As David walked away, the room erupted into quiet applause, the diners' respect for him evident. Langston sat frozen in his chair, the sound of clapping a stark reminder of his humiliation. But the night wasn't over yet. As David disappeared into the back, the young waiter, Samuel, re-emerged, his hands trembling slightly as he approached Langston's table. What happened next would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned. Langston sat in silence, his face pale and his hands gripping the edge of the table. The weight of David's words still hung heavily in the air, and the quiet applause from the diners felt like a final nail in the coffin of his pride. He avoided eye contact with everyone, wishing he could disappear. Just as the tension seemed to settle, Samuel, the young waiter Langston had insulted, approached the table. His steps were hesitant, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a fresh glass of water on a tray. The room went silent once again, all eyes turning toward the brave young man. Langston looked up, his expression filled with a mix of shame and confusion. What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Samuel set the tray down carefully, placing the glass of water on the table in front of Langston. His voice was soft but steady. "I'm here to serve you, sir," he said, his tone calm yet filled with quiet strength. Langston blinked, taken aback by the gesture. "After everything I said to you," he muttered, his voice faltering, "why would you—" Samuel stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "Because this is my job," he said simply, "and because respect isn't something I give just to people who deserve it. It's something I give because it's who I am." The room seemed to exhale all at once, the sheer grace and dignity of Samuel's words leaving everyone speechless. Even David, who had been watching from the back, paused, a faint smile of pride crossing his face. Langston swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he tried to find the words to respond. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was truly at a loss. The arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something entirely unfamiliar: humility. Langston began, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the things I said. He stopped, shaking his head as if the words weren't enough. "I was wrong." Samuel nodded slightly, a small but genuine smile on his face. "Apology accepted, sir," he said. "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." With that, Samuel turned and walked away, his head held high. The diners erupted into quiet applause once again, this time directed at the young waiter whose grace under pressure had inspired them all. Langston sat there for a long moment, staring at the glass of water on the table. He felt a mix of emotions, shame, regret, but also something new: respect. Not just for Samuel, but for the lesson he had learned that evening. As he stood to leave, Langston paused by the counter where Samuel was busy cleaning up. Reaching into his wallet, Langston pulled out a stack of bills, far more than the cost of his meal, and placed it gently in Samuel's hand. "This isn't just a tip," Langston said quietly. "It's a thank you for showing me what real respect looks like." Samuel hesitated, then nodded, accepting the gesture with a quiet, "Thank you, sir." As Langston exited the restaurant, the fresh night air hitting his face, he realized that tonight hadn't just been about a meal. It had been a wake-up call, a chance to reflect on the kind of person he had been and the kind of person he wanted to be. Inside, David watched from the corner of the room, his expression thoughtful. He turned to Samuel and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled that better than most people ever could," David said. "You didn't just teach him a lesson. You taught all of us. Samuel smiled, his confidence restored. I just did what felt right, he said simply. As the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, the story of that evening lingered in the air, a powerful reminder that true strength lies in grace, and respect is earned not through wealth, but through character. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful and inspiring moments that remind us of the value of kindness, respect, and humility. Stay tuned for the next chapter.